Tess, congratulations.
Thank you.
On the UNCTAD Least Developed Countries Report 2015. I mean, this is something dear to our heart at UNCDF, and every year we wait with bated breath for this report to come out, because, as you know, we are the UN agency, or a UN agency specifically dedicated to promoting development in the least developed countries. So your analysis is very important to us.
Well, I'm so glad you say that, because our hope in writing this report is exactly that, to provide information plus also sort of policy direction and from our research, in the hope then that both governments and also agency could use it to help LDCs. So I'm glad you say that. Thank you.
No problem at all. And I mean, this is a big moment for LDCs. As you know, many of them are approaching graduation, and one of the issues we're looking at is graduation. They can achieve it by meeting the statistical barriers to graduation, but does that mean they are structurally transformed? And I noticed that the topic of this report is transforming rural economies. Why did you choose that topic?
Well, actually, it's linked to last year's report in a way, because last year we looked at the growth and transformation issue with a focus on MDGs and how this group of countries performed MDGs, because 2015, the end of the MDG. We found out that, first of all, not all of them are meeting the MDGs, the 7 goals. There's only one country, Laos, will be meeting all the 7 goals. The others have made a lot of progress, especially on education, things like child mortality and so on. Also in access to water. But there are gaps, definitely gaps. So that was a bit of a curiosity, because the emphasis the last 15 years have been on MDG, through PRSPs and other programs. So we looked at growth process, because they were growing very high at 7.2%, and why that did not lead to poverty reduction, why that did not lead to this group of countries achieving the MDGs. And in the process of doing that, we noticed that certain countries, typically sort of the ones that have been moving into manufacturing, have been performing well. I'm talking about Cambodia, Laos, and Bhutan because of energy, and Bangladesh. And that was a bit of a curiosity. We started investigating even more, and we found out that what they did in agriculture, especially moving from focusing on farming on to non-farm economic activity, was very important. So we start noticing that upgrading in the technological sense, and also value addition in agriculture, was an important component of this better performance by this group of countries. So that's really why we thought that perhaps we should focus in agriculture this year.
That's extremely interesting, and I mean, you raised 2 separate points there, and maybe I'll come to them in turn. I mean, the first point, and a more general point, is you mentioned we're coming to the end of the MDGs, it's now the SDGs. The LDCs have been growing at a rate of 7.2% collectively, but we're not meeting the MDGs, many of them. And that raises the issue of the meaning of the word transformation and the SDGs, because what you're essentially saying is that the aggregate growth rate does not necessarily equal meeting the MDGs or poverty reduction or even transformation. So you can grow but remain structurally a weak and basically structurally a poor country, even though you're growing very fast. Could you just very briefly explain to the listeners what that actually means for UNCTAD and what you meant by that?
Well, as you know, always we've advocated in the international organizations, everyone, for growth. Growth definitely is very important, because that's where countries start accumulating and wealth, creating wealth and so on. But what we're learning is that it can grow without necessarily having a major impact, because if that growth is driven by activities or sectors was a poor is concentrated,
Yes.
then we're noticing that the impact of growth is less.
Right.
Yeah, like for example, a typical LDC,
Yes.
on average, as you know, about 69,
Yes.
70% of population lives in rural area,
Correct.
with farming being the main activity. If what is driving the growth of a particular country,
Yeah.
such country,
Yes.
is from mining sector,
Yes.
extractive, for example, or consumption,
Yes.
then unless, of course, there is a conscious effort to translate that surplus
Yes.
to develop agriculture, then the impact it has on agriculture will be less.
Absolutely.
This is exactly what this is why the figures of 7.2%, which is really good news,
Yes. Yes.
because this group of countries, as you know, in the 80s,
Yes.
were sort of negative growth,
Yes.
but suddenly it was really good news
Yeah.
that they were growing. But looking at it in terms of impact, we're noticing that the impact is not that we expected.
Absolutely. No, that's very useful, and of course, for us, our aim is to really try to get that growth to translate itself into poverty reduction, if you like. And I'll come on to that in a moment. And we try to do that through financial inclusion, building fixed capital, building fiscal space, so we can, at the local level, to transform that growth in that way. But before coming on to that bigger picture, you mentioned rural transformation, and you mentioned the difference between Laos, Bangladesh, and Cambodia, and some other countries in terms of the transformation. Could you just drill down a little bit more in detail? What did you discover was the key to growth that reduced poverty?
Okay. Now, we are now linking growth with structural transformation, and let me explain. Sometimes we talk about the structural change of economies, and we are referring, when we say that the, for example, contribution or the proportion of agriculture to GDP was, say, 50%, and then gradually it goes to 30%, services goes up. This we describe as structural change. That is a form of structural change. But for us, structural transformation is not only that.
Okay.
Yeah. Structural transformation is when, through policy, countries are moving from traditional activities to modern activities. Through low value to higher value activities or production of goods. From low technology to higher technology, from agriculture into manufacturing with productivity improvement. That is qualitative structural change, and which means creating better jobs, better paying jobs, which means that upgrading technology, which means that more education, more training, if we're going to move into higher value. That type of structural transformation leads to inclusiveness and creates jobs. Now, some of these countries like Cambodia and Bangladesh and a country like Laos have done is that they've used the duty-free, quota-free market access opportunities that are given to LDCs to move into higher value activities like manufacturing. And if you take Bangladesh now, 4 million people are employed in the garment and textile area. And the country is generating now about $24 billion in export. Now, there are a lot of issues in terms of the quality of the job, but that employment in the manufacturing is qualitatively, in terms of income, different than what these young ladies and men used to earn in the countryside. So the movement from rural area into city is because of the pool of job creation in the manufacturing, rather than the push of lack of opportunity in the rural area. That's why we thought that we should look at non-farm rural economic activities, but in a way when these young people and farmers stop farming and start business in the rural area, that's really upgrading in terms of the income, in terms of the activity they do, especially from subsistence into non-farm activity. They do that because the income in the farming area is not enough. So in a way, that kind of rural transformation we're talking about, it also slows down the migration, because what's happening now is that if you don't have the non-farming rural economy not developed well, as you improve productivity, and less people will be needed to farm.
Yes.
So the young people just go to the
Yes.
city,
Yes.
and if there are no jobs in the
Yes.
city, well, they try abroad.
Yeah.
But this is yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, this is very helpful, and this is exactly where we are focusing right now,
Yeah.
because I think that's a great description
Yeah.
of the problematic. And yes, we need these non-farm rural jobs that will stop migration, but migration is happening anyway, and the first port of call is often these small towns. Sort of
Yeah.
rural, semi-urban towns,
Yeah.
and that's where we are putting a lot of our
Yeah.
attention right now, because our analysis is that these small towns, I'm talking about 500,000 people
Yeah.
and below,
Yeah.
100,000,
Yeah.
200,000, actually are kind of urban and rural, and you need them to provide markets for this non-farm
True.
rural activity you're talking about.
True.
And to provide the kind of the hub
True.
for that value
Yeah.
addition.
Yeah.
How do you see the role of these small towns
Yeah.
and secondary cities in your analysis?
Absolutely critical. In fact, the way you described what you're doing is exactly what we are proposing, actually, because we define policy that governments could use in a rural
Right.
area by differentiating between different regions in the
Right.
rural, because there's considerable difference in the rural area.
Yes.
So, for example, we have 3-4 categories.
Yes.
The peri-urban
Yes.
area and the rural area within commuting distance
Yes,
of
exactly.
these towns.
Yeah.
And we find that farmers in that area have better access
Yes.
to finance,
Yeah.
markets,
Yeah.
in terms of selling and buying,
Yeah.
than, for example, another category, the intermediate.
Yes.
These are not very far, but not commuting
Yes.
distance. And then we identify also the remote area
Yeah.
and isolated area.
Yeah.
And there are places
Yeah.
like that. In our study,
Yeah.
we show that it's not uncommon to find communities living in places where on average it takes from 16 to 20 hours to get to the nearest town, not even city,
Yes.
town, you know.
Yes.
And there are no roads. And these communities,
Yeah.
they are really, in terms of their needs are great,
Yes.
but the opportunities are limited.
That's right.
So for them, their future and development defined by the next
Yes.
town.
Next town.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
So because that's where the demands will come,
Yeah.
and in fact the dynamics of rural transformation comes from what we call the supply-demand sort of virtuous circle,
Yes.
where the demands in these towns
Yes.
sort of generating the supply response from agriculture. So in that respect, I think this report really is in line to what you're trying to do. I may add one thing. We find that, as you know, rural area, a lot of the poor lives there,
Right.
the disadvantaged.
Yes.
But within that group,
Mm.
there are also even more disadvantaged
Yes.
women.
Yes.
A gender issue, we have the whole chapter on gender,
Right.
you know. But interestingly, you find in a lot of studies, a lot of academic studies, to show that they're also the ones that generate activities outside farming
Yes.
to generate income.
Yes.
So the potential female rural entrepreneurship is there.
Yeah.
But the more remote
Yes.
the area, intermediate, the more challenging
Yeah.
in terms of access to capital, access to inputs.
Right.
Even the extension service doesn't reach them. So this very enterprising
Yes.
group of women needs support.
Yeah.
So that's where,
Yeah.
for example, the Capital Development Fund can be very critical.
Oh, that's really
Yeah.
interesting and useful to know. I mean, incidentally, we have programs in the area of inclusive finance and in the area of local development and infrastructure investment that specifically target women. So we're using that analysis. So I think it's very useful to know that there's a chapter in the report on that, and this will certainly help us make the case for these programs, because we share your view that in terms of transformation, the role of women in the economy is fundamental.
Yeah.
But I'd like to take a step back a little bit now and look strategically at, if you like, the dream scenario and the nightmare scenario for the LDCs.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with the bad news. The if you like, the nightmare scenario. I mean, there's a lot of talk in economics about the middle income trap, and how some countries get stuck in this middle income country trap. Now, we believe that and I wanted to share this with you, is there's a potentially a kind of least developed country trap as well, where countries can get stuck in a certain structure of their economies and not get out of it. Mm-hmm. And I think you put your finger on it, really. I mean, what that would involve would be these mega cities, very large capital cities, that are really the only place where there is opportunity at any significant scale.
Yeah.
So large-scale migration to these capital cities, further migration out of the countries, the secondary cities not being fully connected with the rural economies, and the rural economies not transforming themselves, and added to that, the continued urbanization, which is to some extent inevitable. I mean, UNDESA calculate that we are now at peak rural, and the rate of urbanization means that there will never be more people living in the rural areas than there are now, and gradually it'll be an urban world. But what kind of urban world? Because it could be a peri-urban world with lots of very poor secondary cities, mega cities, and then migration. That is the, if you like, the nightmare scenario, with the income still deriving from a couple of key commodities, maybe commodity exports plus some large plantations or something like that. That earlier type of economic activity you described. So in this nightmare scenario, you could still get growth.
Yes.
And you could even still get graduation from LDC status. But you would not get an economy that offered opportunities for many people. So our concern really is how to avoid this nightmare scenario. I thought I'd just share that with you, and any initial response from your side.
David, 100%, I agree with you. This scenario is there, and unfortunately, there are signs that this is the way countries are heading.
Right.
Unfortunately. But you described exactly what our research is pointing. Of course, in recognition of this, many countries are now trying to move into manufacturing. You may have heard that a lot of these industrial zones are being set up now, industrial parks, and there's effort to attract investment from China, from some Asian countries, in the hope that in the cities at least, the mass unemployed, the young will be absorbed. But some of the figures are a bit worrying. There are about 17 million people join the labor market in LDCs. In some countries, like Ethiopia, for example, is around 1.4 million a year. That's very large. Even in a small economy like Niger and so on, is around about 300,000, 350,000 a year. That's a lot. The rate at which countries can generate what we call, according to our law, decent jobs, meaning that well-paying, decent job, is difficult. This is what the challenge is, exactly in the scenario you have described. You're absolutely right, also cities are growing up. Although in LDC, our finding is that until 2030-35, the rate of growth of rural area population growth will be higher than the cities. Although you're right, that's a movement towards the mega thing, which means that now about 450 million people are below the poverty line in LDCs. And in 2030, we'll see how that will reduce. What is worrying and shown in the report is that when we talk about below poverty line, which is the accepted measurement is $1.25 measure. In LDCs, we're talking about 60 cents a day on average. In some countries, about 20 cents a day. So when we say eradication of poverty by 2030,
Yes.
the SDG goal. For some of these communities, it is an increase of 5-fold, 6-fold,
Right.
4-fold, to reach even the $1.25.
That's very interesting.
That's very, so it's a challenge,
Yeah.
really a challenge. It's not to say that the goals are unrealistic. I think the goals are good, and we should aspire for that. But the challenges are tremendous. Yeah.
No, absolutely. No, they're very challenging. And I think to finally, I'd like to look at the last point you made and really contrast the role of foreign direct investment and the role of domestic resource mobilization. You know, you mentioned these attempts to create manufacturing zones, tax-free zones, etc., and attract investment from abroad. But I mean, in our view, and I wanted to sort of share this with you, the sustainable growth of these economies will really come by reinvesting and recycling domestic resources into manufacturing, rather than countries competing with each other to have the lowest tariff barriers possible. And I want to share you a story with a meeting with one of the Asian LDC governments. They were complaining that they created a manufacturing zone. They gave tax breaks to companies to set up there, and people were migrating from the rural areas to the cities, but they were choosing to work in tourism and service industries and not work in industrial jobs in this manufacturing zone. And the government was complaining, and I asked the ministers, well, maybe the employers in the manufacturing zone should put up the wages. And the government said, oh no, they can't do that, because then they would just leave Laos and leave that country and go somewhere else. So it was like a race to the bottom to try to. So I mean, what's your view of kind of the role of domestic resource mobilization versus foreign direct investment, and then the complementary role of both of them?
I think, as highlighted in all these big summits, conferences, including FFD and so on, domestic resource mobilization is absolutely critical, because it gives governments a lot of say and a lot of also independence and how the resources are allocated. So from that perspective, I think it's something that the government should really look into seriously. This is number one. Number two, there is a view that, well, the problem about domestic resource mobilization is that these countries are poor, income is low, and they've been also reducing tariffs to be able to integrate better into the international trading system. And governments used to generate a lot of revenue from tariffs, but now tariffs are lower, it's not coming, and the people's income is low, and how do you expect taxing people? Well, you know, even poor people save. You know, whatever little I'm sure you find out through your work. So it's very interesting to see that the countries that have taken this domestic resource mobilization seriously and that have improved their taxation system and the method of taxing people and so on. A good example would be Ethiopia. We were surprised how much they could raise from domestic resources. Now, of course, people don't like taxing, taxes and so on. But on average, they have improved by about 18% the resources they can mobilize locally. That's why such governments have been able to increase public investment and create jobs and so on. So I think this is an objective many countries should take seriously. And from UN, like the Development Fund and us, should help them find ways to improve domestic resource mobilization. But FDI, you're right, has played important role in many countries, and that's why LDCs and African countries want to attract FDI. And we all know the arguments, and FDI comes with capital, with technology, with marketing know-how, and it enables you to produce goods and then sell and so on. But you're absolutely right also that sometimes governments compete and provide all sort of, in some cases, unrealistic incentives to attract FDI. And it's been argued that the benefits are not always clear. But having said that, since these are capital shortage economies, they can't ignore FDI.
Yeah.
It's a question of how to get it where, and I think if countries know what they want,
Yes.
and FDI will come and do
Yeah.
what FDI does, But I think they have to have a clear policy. I think another source of finance we haven't perhaps mentioned is the ODA.
Yes.
And I think it will continue to be important for LDCs. In our report, we say that there is now an agreement that the 0.7%
Yes.
out of that for LDCs, as you know, 0.15 to
Yeah.
0.02
Yeah.
should be for LDCs,
Yes.
and some Nordic countries have met that
Yes.
objective, which is really great. And ODA going to LDCs is now reaching around, I think, 45
Yes.
billion. It's gone up a bit.
Yeah.
So we are arguing here that SDGs changes this scenario, and SDGs are ambitious, and the type of infrastructure in terms of meeting the water, sanitation, electricity, and other infrastructure is very costly. We argue that the 40 to 50% of what needs to be done to meet SDG is going to be because of LDCs,
Right.
because that's where the limitations and shortfalls are. So we argue that if the amount of ODA going to LDCs increases to 0.35,
Right.
for example, that will raise up to $250 billion by 2030 a year. And that at least will be, they will be able to meet some of these demands in terms of electricity,
Right.
access to electricity, connectivity, roads, and water, sanitation as an infrastructure.
No, that's very interesting, and of course it's important that this ODA is made sustainable, because it's not going to last forever, as we can see. And one of the things that we're looking at is how ODA can be used to maximize domestic resource mobilization, therefore to get onto that sustainable path. And there are some ideas we're exploring. I mean, one is to look at issues such as pension funds and domestic bank deposits, which are also forms of domestic resources, and how to create mechanisms for them to be invested into local economies. And of course another one is domestic resource mobilization through local government. Because yes, people don't like to pay taxes, but they also do like to have local services. And the local governments are often sometimes in a better position to imaginatively and creatively mobilize resources. And finally, of course, there is domestic resource mobilization through financial inclusion, and to kind of reach the unbanked is a way to mobilize savings that exist but are not kind of in the financial system. So we believe that through pension funds, bank deposits, fiscal decentralization, and supporting local governments in mobilizing resources, and through financial inclusion and savings and reaching unbanked people, it's possible to actually maximize the pool of domestic resources. And then the challenge then is to target that to the investments necessary in the right places, away from the capital cities and into these local areas.
I think this is where the UN Capital Development Fund becomes even more important now, because of this leveraging you need to do. Because I think it's recognized, and we've seen it during the debate and discussions for SDG, that a lot of resource, a lot of capital is needed, will be needed to achieve the SDGs. And as you saw, liquidity is not the problem, the pension funds, how to get it what is needed is the problem. Now the UN Capital Development Fund has been there already, helping at developing countries. Now the role it can play in terms of leveraging this private capital to play its part is going to be critical. So I think it's really your role is going to be even more essential now.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Taz, and we certainly hope so. We certainly hope to be able to contribute, because it's a really big challenge the LDCs are facing, and let's hope that we, collectively and together with the LDC governments, can get all the world's LDCs on a path to sustainable growth, so there are no more LDCs in the near future.
This is it.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
indeed. I really
Thank you.
enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.